Thanks very much, Ukma, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us for a very topical seminar. This presentation is part of our Bio-Entrepreneur series, and it's presented today through our joint CTED, Joint Centre for Technology and Development. Perhaps you could share that slide, please, Ukma. JCTED is a collaboration between SingHealth's Intellectual Property Office, SHIP, and USPTO's Centre for Technology and Development, CTED. JCTED serves as sort of like a front door access for commercialisation across the SingHealth US Academic Medical Centre. Joint CTED's role is to identify commercialisation opportunities, create partnerships, provide access to funding and other resources for health and biomedical technologies within the AMC. If you'd like to learn more, feel free to contact SHIP in SingHealth or CTED at US. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Andrew Serafini and Patrick Ngeim, both attorneys from the US-based patent firm Kilpatrick, Townsend and Stockton. Andrew focuses his practice on providing strategic and comprehensive IP counselling for biotech, biopharmaceutical and other life sciences clients. Andrew has won many accolades. I have known him for a very long time and I'm quite sure they're all true. He has been recognised this year by IP Stars as a patent star in the United States. And for the last 5 years, he has also been recognised by the very prestigious publication IAM Patent 1000, the world's leading patent practitioners, as a top patent practitioner. Patrick's practice includes all aspects of patent prosecution and infringement and validity matters, as well as litigation. His technology areas include artificial intelligence, virtual and augmented reality, and computer software, which places him in an ideal position to address today's topic. So thank you to you both. Over to you.
Okay, we're sharing our screen. Andrew, please take the lead and I'll help you with the presentation.
Sounds great. Thank you, Patrick. Good morning, everyone. Thank you in particular to Catalyst and more in particular to Cheryl and Perul for their gracious invitation for us to participate in today's webinar. Patrick, next slide, please. So what is artificial intelligence? And you may ask, who is John McCarthy? Well, John McCarthy is responsible for coining the term artificial intelligence back in 1956. And he defined AI as the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. Now, that was in 1956. We find ourselves in 2020, a very interesting year for all of us, I'm sure. And the modern definition, or one of the modern accepted definitions of AI, is the study and design of intelligent agents, where an agent is a system that perceives its environment and takes actions which maximizes its chances of success. So if you want to think of AI in the broadest sense, AI refers to machines that can learn, reason, and act for themselves. Next slide. So today's agenda will cover these 4 main bullets. AI, the convergence of technologies, outlook and growth, protecting AI inventions, patent filing best practices, and an actual real live example. Next slide. And now for the first part of our presentation. So AI. So use of a computer to model intelligent behavior with minimal intervention. And machines and computers programs are capable of learning and problem solving, similar to a human brain. AI is the big umbrella where deep learning, multi-layer neural networks as an example, and machine learning, ability to learn without explicit programming, all fall within the umbrella or the shadow of AI. Next slide. So AI and the convergence of technology. Well, there are various technologies at play: biological sciences, nanotechnology, cognitive sciences, material sciences, information technology, all converge with AI. And we have seen clients, Patrick and I, and others at our firm, where clients leverage the power of big data, algorithms, and computing to develop breakthrough research and products driving critical improvements in healthcare and global health, an active topic each and every year, and in particular this year. So the convergence of technologies is enabling new opportunities in a very broad sense in healthcare and life science markets. And this spans what one would consider traditional healthcare IT, to digital health, to diagnostics, to next generation therapeutics, and automated scientific discovery. So we see our clients in AI and healthcare touch upon robotic surgery, virtual nursing assistance, aiding clinical judgment and/or diagnosis, precision, formerly referred to a lot as personalized medicine, medical diagnostics, research, among others. So what are the top applications in healthcare? These, there are many reports, and Accenture did several reports. And you can basically classify healthcare AI in these categories. In not any particular order, but all of these categories touch the convergence of AI applications in healthcare. And you may ask, well, what is cybersecurity? Well, there is a tremendous amount of data and privacy issues that AI and healthcare are in the midst of. So connected machines, clinical trial participant identifiers, all of these are at play in healthcare. Next slide. And it's very interesting to see, even as early as last week, that we are seeing more and more AI in the news. In one example, and we can give you the reference afterwards, you have an artificial intelligence network developed by DeepMind, and that is a Google AI offshoot. And they are determining a protein's 3D shape from its amino acid sequence. In fact, there was a competition, and DeepMind's AI for protein 3D shape blew away all the competition. And also, in a paper published in the IEEE Journal of Engineering and Medicine Biology, there's a team that reported that an AI model distinguished asymptomatic people from healthy individuals through forced cough recordings. It is amazing what we are seeing happen in the convergence of AI with healthcare. Next slide. So what is the regional outlook of AI? Well, we have the world generally represented in these 5 regions. But it's interesting to point out here, Patrick, next, that many reports that have come out in 2019 and 2020, the Asia Pacific region is expected to show the fastest compound annual growth rate, or CAGR, owing to growing AI-based startups, improving IT infrastructure, and increasing the adoption of technologies. That has put Asia Pacific region, Australia, Japan, South Korea, China, Singapore, really at the forefront as one of the fastest regions for compound annual growth rate in AI healthcare. Next slide. So what is behind the AI growth engine? Well, looking at the US market alone, the healthcare market is expected to grow from US $5 billion in 2020 and reach $45 billion by 2026. And that is 4.45% during the period, the same period. And these are only some of the factors that we feel are driving this growth of the market. We were talking before our seminar began about age and records and vinyl and CD players and tape players. Well, we have a growing worldwide aging population. One thing that seems to be consistent is that individual healthcare expenses are increasing worldwide. The volume of healthcare data is growing, but importantly, the growing number of cross-industry partnerships and collaborations, which are key to the AI growth engine. Next slide. For example, Microsoft, together with Apollo Hospitals in India, which is a prominent healthcare system in India, focused on developing and deploying new machine learning models for predicting the risk of developing cardiac disease and to aid doctors in treatment planning. So Microsoft is doing a lot more than the chime you hear when you start up your PC. That's a Microsoft-based PC. Next slide. So another major fueling the market growth is the adoption of technology by multiple pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies across the world, and in particular this year, to expedite vaccine or drug development processes in COVID-19 pandemic. So this adoption of deep learning that we see in various healthcare applications, especially in medical imaging, disease diagnostics, and drug discovery, is fueling this growth, this AI growth. We often see technologies where there are different sensors and devices that derive a patient's health status in real time, and that patient is not even in the hospital. Medical imaging and diagnostics segment can also be seen as helping contribute to this incredible growth in the AI marketplace. And again, there's a large volume of imaging data. Now, there are advantages, for example, to radiologists in diagnosis and treatment and management, but there is a significant influx of large number of startups in this segment worldwide. And Patrick and I have the opportunity of representing several of them. And I think we can't forget that this demand in the world for personalized care, the need to reduce hospital readmissions because they say a hospital is one of the worst places to go when you're sick, and the convenience offered by AI products and solutions are all factors that are driving the growth of the patient segment in the AI healthcare market. Because in the end of the day, AI healthcare, AI in the life sciences, there is the patient at the end of all of this. Next slide. So what are the benefits? Well, according to Accenture, when combined with healthcare, it could create 150 billion in annual savings for the US healthcare economy alone by 2020. 150 billion in healthcare, and healthcare costs are, I'm sure, extraordinary around the world, and certainly no less in the United States. And we find AI in medicine, for both the virtual and physical. The virtual AI aspect would be in electronic healthcare records, neural network-based guidance and treatment decisions, all very, very important. And in the physical, we're going to have doctors, and we have doctors today, using robotics to help perform surgeries, to assist in surgeries, and intelligent prostheses for physically challenged people, as well as for elder care. And while I won't go in great detail on all of these points, but these are additional benefits that AI is impacting in healthcare and in the life sciences. And it's important to note that, patient safety is key, And if there is this great amassing of data, the AI system is key in extracting this information from large patient populations, and is certainly a driver in the vaccine space that I mentioned for the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. And again, many people, you find yourselves in a doctor's office and you're speaking to a clinician that appears to be very, very young, but now there should be no argument that if you use AI in healthcare, you'll be able to have an experienced clinician at the ask all the time. As a matter of fact, the 24/7 aspect of a medical expert is becoming commonplace given AI. And as we'll touch upon later in this presentation, human judgment, there's no replacement for that, but it can improve certain functional areas of healthcare. And one area that we see quite a bit of success is in radiology diagnosis. Next slide. So with the promises, there are challenges. And I think there are still developmental costs to AI. There's the data privacy and data security issues that we mentioned before. And at least in the United States, as we're sure elsewhere around the world, state and federal regulations in the US can lead to these AI challenges. Now, researchers have embraced AI. There has been a hint of reluctance of the medical community to adopt AI. And why is that? Well, there's the apparent lack of human touch, empathy, and emotional intelligence that many people are missing. We appreciate the ability to come to you live in this webinar, but as Cheryl and Pearl will know, I come to Singapore 2 to 3 times a year, and there's something about speaking actually in front of all of you. But we embrace what's before us. Next slide. So it's great that there's this investment. There's this expanded growth in healthcare and life sciences, the development of vaccines around the world using AI, because the AI is rapidly transforming the entire world. Now, as we see this influence grow, the value of AI also grows across wide-ranging industries and disciplines. But what do innovators want to do? They're investing tens of thousands of US dollars, hundreds of millions of US dollars in research. But how can these key players, researchers, clinicians, and founders of startup companies protect this value? Well, what we'll do now is we'll turn to the questions and issues surrounding AI patent protection in the US, including best strategies for protecting AI implemented inventions, but that Patrick and I have employed for companies. So this is free, and it's not legal advice, it's legal education, but we'd like you to stay alert, stay awake, because you're going to be getting some key things here to protect AI inventions in the US under US patent jurisprudence. Patrick?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I'll be presenting next. We'll have a deep dive into the various legal aspects of how AI can be protected. Before I do, I just want to mention a personal story based on one of the slides that Andrew gave. If you remember, there was a slide on using an AI model where you could cough or have an audio of someone coughing, and then that AI model could tell you if you have COVID or not. I have an older brother who is a medical doctor. Last time I visited him was a year and a half ago, pre-COVID, and I was sitting there with him, and I'm not kidding, every 5 minutes he'd get a voice message on an application called WhatsApp. I'm not sure if it's popular in Singapore or not. And he would have a patient or a friend coughing into that voice message and asking, "Hey, doctor, what's wrong with me?" And I think back at that moment, it's like, I wish he had that AI model on his phone, because he could answer so many questions from his patients and probably answer them properly. Or maybe his patients or friends had that application on their phone and there's no need for him to kind of spend energy on that, and he would be able to focus on something else. So AI is impacting our lives, our daily lives, and I expect it to continue, that impact to continue to grow over the next few years. So when we say AI, you know, and think of it from the perspective of protecting the AI invention, right? So what is AI? We need to define it in terms of what can we protect, right? Typically, or usually AI is a type of software. It's a software model, right? There's a push in the industry in more recent years to for AI in terms of hardware, you know, hardware that implements AI functionality. But for the purpose of this presentation, we'll talk about AI as a software model. There's three areas where, you know, we want to think about, and I try to show that with this visual on the right-hand side of the presentation. There's the AI model itself, right? You know, what this is a neural network. I have so many layers. This is the input layer. This is the output layer. Here's the connections and stuff like that, right? So you could go and protect the AI model itself. Oftentimes, the AI model is an off-the-shelf AI model, and the novelty or the invention itself is how do we train that AI model to do something that we want? How do we train it to predict that, you know, given a cough, audio of a cough, there, you know, the patient has COVID or not, right? So you could put, if that's where the invention is, you don't need to protect the AI model, but you could protect how you train that AI model to do something, right? And then also the third area is this inference use case. It's a AI model, it's been trained, but we're using it in a specific way, right? What are my specific inputs? What are my specific outputs? What is the kind of the key application for using that AI model? So those are the kind of the three main areas that you can protect from a patent perspective, your AI invention. Just showing you some chart in terms of the growth or the number of patent applications that relate to the AI in the US. Each of these charts correspond to a particular type of AI, planning and control. So this is not limited to the medical field, but it could be planning, control, knowledge processing, vision, AI, hardware, and stuff like that. The point is, as you could see over the years, that growth has been exponential, especially in recent years. I just put this vertical line here at the year 2014. That's a very critical year for a change in the law in the US that I'll be talking about. And as you could see, shortly after 2014, there was a dip in terms of the number of AI applications that had been filed, just because of how the law changed the type of protection you could get, right? But it took us about a year, maybe a year and a half, to adjust to that change of the law. And as you could see, from mid 2015 and on, that kind of growth continued, or the number of filing continued to grow, right? Overall, again, there's a continuous exponential growth, I would say, and even with the change to the law in 2014. So I'll be talking about the kind of three main hurdles to obtain a patent in the US, and that would apply to any type of invention, whether AI or something else. One, the invention has to be subject matter eligible, and I'll focus the discussion on in the next few slides on this hurdle here, just because it impacts most the AI inventions. Your invention has to be novel, which means that no one else has done this before, and you can't find a single piece of reference, a publication, or a system that has these different components that your invention performs. And your invention has to be non-obvious. Okay, it's not novel, or maybe it's novel, no one else has done the same thing, but maybe if you put the different pieces together, your invention, in light of that combination of pieces, is so obvious to someone who knows this art, or who is familiar with this art, right? If you are subject matter eligible, your invention is novel, and it's non-obvious, then you could get a patent out of that patent application. Again, for the purpose of this invention, and with the change to the law, the focus of the rest of the presentation is going to be the subject matter eligibility here. Let me just check quickly There's a question that is coming. Andrew, do you want to answer the question now, or I think this relates to kind of your presentation.
Sure, we can talk about it now, and if there's follow-ups, we can talk about it at the end of the presentation as well. So the question was asked, who would be held responsible if AI-led solution affects patient health? The company or the doctor working on duty? That's a very interesting question, but there's a premise, at least spoken quite a bit in the United States, is that it would be certainly bad form to sue the doctor. And if you, sorry, there's another message that came in. If you had a situation where a doctor was using some AI diagnostic tool to assist, and a decision is made, and then a treatment, a certain treatment modality was used, I think just like you have warning labels on various medications around the world that this particular drug could do anything, including kill you, the patient has to understand that the liability will likely not lay with the doctor. If there is a negligent issue with the machine or with the AI process, then it will likely go to the manufacturer. But the doctor, it would be hard pressed to find liability in the doctor. And we can talk about that more at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Just proceeding with the presentation, and please feel free to ask those questions at any point in time. We'll answer them as they come up, or we could save the answers to the end of the presentation. So what do we mean by subject matter eligible, and how, what does that mean? What do we need to do? How do we make sure that we meet that requirement for obtaining a patent, right? So again, back to 2014, there was a Supreme Court decision that we refer to as Alice. And as I show in this graphic here, pre-2014, meeting that hurdle was very easy. We actually barely thought about it for most of the time, right? But after 2014, that hurdle increased a lot. We've changed the way we write patent application, the way we focus patent applications drastically since that 2014 court decision. The decision is, if your invention is directed to a fundamental economic practice, a certain method of organizing human activity, an idea of itself, something that you could perform in your mind, right, on a piece of paper, or some mathematical relationship or formula, right, E = mc² or something like that, right? That invention itself, you cannot obtain a patent on, right? So think of it from a perspective of AI, right? Let's say your AI, you have all these medical records, and all what the AI is doing is organizing these medical records, pulling them from different sources maybe, and creating maybe one universal record for a patient that could be used across different hospitals, right? The USPTO will look at this. Well, this is a method of organizing human activity. It's a method where you're pulling data from different records, and you want to present them in one record. A human could do that. They'll benefit how humans organize information, and maybe maybe doing it with a computer or with the AI makes it faster or something like that. But you could do it also on a piece of paper, right? Or take your time and go between these different records and then create your records manually, right? So from that perspective, the USPTO is going to come back and say that type of invention, although it uses AI, well, that's not something that you could obtain a patent on. Or in a different example, yeah, you have an AI model, but at the end of the day, the AI model is just it's a mathematical model that correlates different nodes and points and stuff like that. So it's really a mathematical concept, right? From that perspective, you cannot obtain a patent, right? So those are the kind of hurdles that were put in place in 2014 against obtaining a patent on AI. Yeah, so sorry, I'm looking, there's a question. When it comes to patent infringements, one would need to detect it. What is your opinion on the utility of AI patents when it's challenging to detect infringement since it's software-based? Thank you for the question. I have a slide that covers that aspect. So when we get, this is kind of near the end of the presentation, so I'll talk about that in a few slides from now. So here's what it means in terms of approaching this hurdle here, right? Is your invention, the way it's claimed, the way, you know, the way you define your invention with legal terms, is your invention directed to an abstract idea? You know, mathematical formula, economic practice, organizing human activity, or a mental concept? If so, then you cannot get, if so, you're not subject matter eligible. Sorry, if it's not directed to an abstract idea, then you could obtain a patent, right? Bearing that you also meet the novelty and non-obviousness requirements. But if you're directed to an abstract idea, that's not the end of the story, right? You move down to, do we have a practical application here? Is this trying to solve a problem, a technical problem? And does it solve it in a unique way, right? If you answer yes, then you could obtain a patent. If you answer no, then you look at the invention itself, the way it's defined, it's claimed, and say, is there something more than simply the abstract idea, right? Is this really something that cannot be done absent this AI model or absent this kind of computer environment, right? If the answer is yes, you cannot do it in other ways, right? Then this could be, you could obtain a patent on that. If not, then this is when you say, well, this is not eligible, we cannot obtain a patent on that. So there's these 3 steps that we need to go through when we prepare a patent application, when we engage the inventors or the client or the company to figure out what are the risks and how can we handle these risks. So from best practices that we've seen over the years is we need, in the invention, we need to distinguish between what the idea is, here's what we want to do, and how we do it, right? We need to describe in the patent application itself the specific way of how we do things, right? So let's say we have an invention on, you know, having audio coughing and then detecting COVID, right? So the idea is we detect COVID based on audio recording using an AI model, right? On its own, that's not going to be enough. We need to say, how do we do that, right? You know, what type of machine learning are we using? Here's the type of data that we input to that machine learning. Here's maybe how that machine learning is trained, kind of the blueprints of how this would work. We need to very well define that in the application, right? And we need, as we write this patent application, we need to say, okay, here's what we want to do. Here's some of the technical challenges that you have, right? Maybe the technical challenge is we don't have enough data to train this model, so we need to use some synthetic data or some simulated data or something like that. Or maybe the data itself is because, you know, COVID patients are only, you know, 1% or a small portion of the population. I don't know what the percentage is, right? Maybe when we take data from the population, it's going to bias the AI model too much, where the AI model is not going to be able to properly predict, you know, the COVID conditions. But the bottom line is we need to define a unique problem that we're trying to solve, right? With this, using the AI to do something, right? And then we need to describe, okay, if we solve it the way we are, we innovated here, here are the benefits, right? Here's the technical advantages that we can achieve, right? We could have an AI model that is 98% accurate, that could be deployed to a cell phone. It's a lightweight machine learning model. It's not, you know, complex piece of hardware, software. It could be run on the user device. It doesn't need to be run on the cloud or something like that, right? And then we need to, when we put, again, what we call the claim, which is the legal definition of what we have invented, we need to link that legal definition to the problem that we're trying to solve, the benefits that we solve, and then the solution itself. So this is I'll try to answer with this slide the question that was asked in terms of detecting infringement, right? So going back, there's three areas we could protect again: the training, the specific use case, and then the architecture, the model itself. Now, if we were to to simply have a patent application on a generic use case, we want to use AI model to predict COVID given audio recording, right? Without much details, we're going to be in this red square here. We're probably not going to pass the subject matter eligibility test. We're probably not going to be novel and inventive. There's probably going to be lots of prior art on that. Now, if we were to focus on training, this is specifically how we train the model itself, and maybe the specific use. We can get more in terms of novelty and inventiveness, non-obviousness. So we have better odds of overcoming the last two hurdles. But the odds for subject matter eligibility are kind of in between. You have better chances simply than the generic use, but the risk is still a little bit higher. If we were to protect the architecture, the specific model itself, and maybe in combination with the training and the use case, then we are in this green square where we're probably going to get a patent, right? Now that being said, infringement becomes it's easy to show infringement when it's the use case, right? When the invention is using AI to do something, right? You could read their publications, you could look for, you could get their AI model and try it and use it. Like the application itself that you have could be enough evidence to show, okay, well, I know that they're using AI, I know these are the inputs to the AI, and these are the outputs, so I know, that could be infringing my patent that does the same thing, right? The training itself is a little bit more difficult to show infringement because training is typically done offline. It's offline on some server that we, as a user, we may not have access to. So that's going to require some more digging and maybe some discovery that some questions that we need to ask the infringer in terms of how do you train it, where do you collect the data, what type of data you collect, what type of processing of the data that you do, and stuff like that. In terms of the model itself, the architecture, if your invention or your patent was on the AI model itself, right, we could show infringement by either looking at the software code itself that the infringer has, or maybe some printed publications that describe what their model is. So let's say you came up with this invention in terms of the model, you filed a patent application on, and then the infringer copied that model. Maybe they wrote their own software, right? But then they made some publications in terms of here's the different layers that we have, and here's the different pieces of the code, and what each piece of the code does, right? So then you could use that as evidence of use. Again, just answer the question briefly. It's easiest to show infringement when your invention is specific to a use case, and it's hardest to show the infringement when your invention is the training of the AI model. We have another question here. Approximately how much costing for getting US patent from India? Andrew, you want to answer that one? Andrew, you're muted.
Go ahead, Patrick. You can.
Okay. So the cost depends on what we get, honestly. If we are getting a full application that, and we do this all the time, by the way, where applications are filed overseas, whether it's India, China, Singapore, Europe, or somewhere else, and those get filed in the US. If the application is what we call in good shape, it meets the requirements of the USPTO. There isn't much effort on us to edit that application. We've seen it, and this is common to the industry, not only our firm, but it could be anywhere between $1,000 to $3,000 to file that application in the US, and that would include also, you would need to include USPTO fees, which are about $1,000, and those could vary depending on the applicant itself. If it's more than that, if it's simply, if there's, we need to edit this application heavily because it's not written in a way that meets the USPTO requirements, and that is also, less often, but it can happen. We're looking at a higher expense, and again, this is an industry-wide expense, anywhere between $8,000 to $15,000, honestly, depending on the complexity of the project itself.
There's another question, Patrick.
Yeah, do you want to take that one, Andrew, or?
Sure, we can tag team as necessary. So another question just came in that said, at what stage could and should a company register their patent? Our understanding would be that you file their patent application is what I believe the question is asked. And that's a great question. The first consideration is how is the competitive space that you're in? How competitive is it? And we need to remember that it's a first to file system. It's like a race to the patent office, no matter where you are in the world. And it's very important to be timely. Now, if you may not have your ideas fully baked, like that loaf of bread is not ready yet, or if you're an author that's writing a 10-chapter book and you only are done with the first 5 chapters that would be represented by your patent application, in this case, a provisional patent application, then we would recommend filing it, and you could always add to that provisional by filing some follow-on provisional applications, and you have 1 year to then put the whole book together or to bake that loaf of bread. And so we think it's earlier is generally better than waiting, even if you have more testing to do. Patrick?
Right. Andrew, if I may add, the US is a little bit more generous than other countries, right? In other countries, if you have published anything about that is going to go in a patent application, before you file that patent application, you are barred from obtaining a patent on that. In the US, you have a year from any publication to file a patent application. So keep that in mind in terms of where you want to obtain protection, US or overseas, or no, I guess I can't call it overseas, but other countries, right? And also, when are you publishing stuff? As a best practice, it's best to file a patent application before you make any publication or what we call public disclosure about what your technology or innovation is.
And just to add, often if you're a startup or spitting out your idea from a university or research institute and looking for funding, many venture capitalists refuse to sign confidentiality agreements or non-disclosure agreements. So our recommendation to our startup clients is always to file at least a provisional application first, and then you could have that core idea protected with that application as you then go about and seek investment from angels and VCs. Come on, Patrick.
I'm sorry, this is a live discussion. So adding to what Andrew is saying, there's a distinction also between provisional and non-provisional. And not to get too technical or in the details of things, but a provisional application, think of it as a quick placeholder application. It's not a full application. And that typically is much less costly than a non-provisional application. So you could do a quick, cheap provisional. You file it with the USPTO office or depending on the jurisdictions or the countries, right? And then you could have those discussions with investors, freely and openly without having to worry about NDAs. And when it's time, you could take that provisional and then out of it file what we call the full application, the non-provisional application, and kind of balance your expenses that way between provisional and non-provisional, and also, having the luxury of having these open discussions with the investors. Okay, so just we'll go back to the presentation. I want to go through one example just to give you a feel of AI and some of the patent hurdles that we see here, right? So this is an example. It's a real example. It's a method. So the invention is about a method of training a neural network. And sorry, there's a typo in the title. It's not for facial detection, but it's for tumor detection, right? So this could be part of computer vision or some other type of AI, but you have an AI that is trained to detect tumors. So you present an image to the AI, and the AI is going to be able to tell you, okay, there's a tumor on this side of the brain, or here's how big the tumor is, or something like that, right? So again, the story here is, yeah, AIs have been used in the past for detecting tumors. The technical issues are that their detection are not too accurate, right? And that's because when you train these AIs, they're trained using perfect image, like these high quality images. But in real life, when you input an image to that AI model, the image may be distorted. There may be some blurring. There may be some issues with the images that we input to those AIs. So absent that perfect image, that we cannot, the accuracy of the AI breaks down fairly quickly, right? So the invention here is we want to improve that accuracy. We're not changing it. It's the same AI model that have been used in the past, but we're changing the way we train it. And the way we train it now gives you better accuracy, better robustness. So what they do in here is they take images, those perfect images that you use in the training, and then you start kind of playing around with these images, introduce, rotate them, mirror them, you change the contrast, maybe you add some blurriness, you distort the images and stuff like that. And then you train with that. But also, when you train with that, you get some false positives, right? Just because now you've kind of played around with the data set, that creates some additional challenges. And the way you solve the second problem is by having this iterative training, where you do the training first with those with the image set that has the perfect images, what I call the perfect images, plus the distorted images. Then you run again with images that don't show any tumors, right? So it's a two-stage type of training. That's kind of what the invention is, and that's how they solve that problem. Given that, then this is how you define, again, this is the claim, and this is how you define your legal boundary of your legal rights to that invention. I've highlighted here two key, what we call limitations in the claim that talks about these two training sets. The first training set that used in the training that includes the modified images, and the second training set that includes non-tumor images that help you resolve the bias that the first training set introduces. The question is subject matter eligible? Yes. Why? For the first step, this is not a fundamental economic practice. It's not a mental process. It's not a method of organizing human activity. And it's not a mathematical concept. So from that perspective, we could fairly say, going back to the test that I showed you before, this is subject matter eligible. Now the USPTO, and depending on the examiners, you may get some pushback and say, well, no, hold on a minute. This is a method of organizing human activity. All what you're doing is, in the past, physicians would look at the images, and now it's just a computer doing that. It's the same thing, right? Then in that case, we would say, okay, well, there's a practical application here, because we're solving these two problems. We're solving this issue with how robust or the bias that you introduce with the images, and also we could handle any type of images now, whether distorted or not. So from that perspective, for this type of invention, you could easily obtain a patent on, assuming that you meet the novelty and non-obviousness. Going back to the question, we have a question that says, there is a growing committee of scientists and public who support open source. faster and more secure way for growing innovation? How do you see this open source in relation to patent application? Andrew, I'm happy to answer that question, or if you
Sure.
want to take it.
We've had some recent experiences with those open source clients, so go ahead.
Right, so open source software does not prohibit you from obtaining a patent. You could still file a patent application, even though your invention or innovation is implemented using open source. However, depending on the type of open source, you may have some licensing obligations. Again, depends on the type of the open source itself. So you may obtain a patent on one hand, but on the other hand, you may have to license it back at a certain rate, or maybe it's a license-free application, license-free royalty, I guess, back to the community. And also, what comes into play is not only the patent applications, but also comes to play copyrights, right? So copyrights protect the software itself, the code itself, and not the function of the code. The function of the code is protected by the patent. The software itself is protected via copyrights. Typically, open source require you to provide a copyright license to the software code itself. So someone else could take that software, piece of software, and use it in their code based on the license of the open source software. Andrew, if you have anything to add, or
no, that's great. You covered it. Thank you. When you can advance to the last slide, and then we can continue receiving questions from the audience.
Right, so there's a question from the audience following up on the infringement question. The question is, legally, to what extent would a company which is accused of infringement be required to furnish or give access to this information? I'll start with the answer. In the US, assuming that there's a court litigation, and assuming that the other side is asking the right question, there's a discovery that is done. And during discovery, again, assuming that the discovery is properly run by the other side, you may be obligated to give them access to the code itself for inspection by the other side. So they could have access to the code. They could have access to blueprints, to any internal communication with the system, any designs, any technical documents that you may have. Yes, Andrew, you want to add anything here?
No, I just want to say that the questions along these lines, and it's something that we don't have time to touch upon today, but there's an issue in the United States called divided infringement. And what goes into a lot of the strategic conversations we have with our startups in particular is, how can you craft claims where you can draft a claim that captures one actor doing everything? Because if you can get one actor doing everything, then you can catch them in direct infringement. But the divided infringement, where say a company does the algorithm, another one does the analysis, there's the doctor getting the sample, you have all these actors, and it's very, very difficult for direct infringement to lay. So part of what we do, both here in the States and what I've done during some of my visits to Singapore, is that we meet with startup incubators, those run by A-Star and Accelerate, and we give some strategic advice on how you can actually focus on some of these issues, because if at the end of the day, what does a startup have? What does a researcher have? And that's the years of investment to develop what they have, and you need to protect it, because otherwise you no longer have an asset. So we are we are sensitive to the time of the seminar. We welcome any more Q&As from the in the chat area, and we just got one. And that's if a new application of an AI algorithm uses existing architectures in the same subject matter, but is implemented better prediction accuracy, for instance, is that sufficient for non-obvious? Well, one of the biggest and strongest arguments that we have is it better? is it, if an examiner says to us, well, that's obvious in view of this, it's like, well, no, I have greater sensitivity. I have greater accuracy. I can do it better. That evidence is a strong and one of the strongest arguments we can make as your patent counsel to get over that non-obviousness hurdle. Patrick, do you want to add?
Yeah, if I might add, Andrew, the key there too is, why are we better, right? What makes us better? And then have those, explain because we use feature A or because we use this widget or something like that, right? We made a tweak to the algorithm, or maybe the training, we do this extra step, right? Something that we could hang our hat on to say, we are better because of this. That would give us, this make our case so strong.
All right, we're about nearly out of time. I don't know if any of our organizers wanted to jump in and corral any final words or questions. There's another question. Could you share some real examples of non-patentable products? Patrick, we've seen a few in our day. Do you want to talk about a non-patentable product?
I would like to say everything.
Based on state law.
Yeah, everything we've done is patentable just because we do good work, Andrew. No, but in all seriousness, when we think of AI again, I've seen pushback from examiners in terms of, the training on its own is not sufficient. You need to have more. It depends on the invention AI, on the AI invention itself. So let me answer the question with an example. If your invention, and this is kind of going outside of the presentation here, but if your invention is using AI to predict, for example, what the US versus euro rate is going to be tomorrow, right? So it's a financial tool that we're using. Getting a patent on that after 2014 is very difficult, right? But if your AI is to predict a health condition in a more accurate way than what humans were able to do, such as you take a cough, audio recording, and predict with a 98% whatever accuracy that the person has COVID or not, that is going to be patented. So think of kind of just that spectrum of where things could be depending on the end application that we have and how we present that innovation to the USPTO.
Great. Well, we welcome further reach out. You can certainly coordinate with Catalyst and with Parole, Cheryl, and others, our gracious hosts, to collect additional queries that you may have in this and related subject matter. And we would be happy to answer those questions in a separate call offline or via email. But you have those resources there in Singapore that could further reach out to us. Cheryl?
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you for that kind offer. And thank you to both of you for joining us today and presenting to us on this topic. It was a very interesting seminar, and I'm sure that we've all learned a great deal. Thanks a lot, guys. See you another time.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Be well, stay healthy, everyone.
You too.